Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Comment on where you're watching from, because the story we're about to unravel together has spanned more than a century without answers. We're talking about a mystery that still haunts the dusty archives of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, and which began on a cold November night in 1901. Back then, Pennsylvania was the industrial heartland of the United States. Pittsburgh grew like a furnace burning day and night, its chimneys spewing dark smoke that tinted the sky gray. But far from the noisy factories and streets teeming with workers, there were places where the silence was absolute. Places where modernity had not yet arrived with its electric light and telegraphs. And it was in one of these forgotten places that it all began. The hilly region north of Pittsburgh was known for its dense woods and winding paths that snaked through deep valleys. The people who lived there were farmers, lumberjacks, simple folk who rarely ventured down to the big city. They relied on each other out of necessity. When winter came early, as it did that year, the communities retreated, waiting for spring to reopen the roads. It was in this setting that Martha Crowley disappeared. She was 28 years old, widowed since her husband died in a sawmill accident 3 years earlier, and lived alone on a small property inherited from her family. Martha was known in the region for her skill with medicinal herbs. People came from far and wide, seeking her preparations for fevers, pains, and stomach ailments. She had a solid reputation, was respected, and had never given cause for suspicion. On the afternoon of November 16, 1901, Martha was last seen walking along the road leading to the Henshaw property, a family that lived about 3 kilometers from her home. She was carrying a basket covered with a white cloth and wearing her brown woolen shawl, the one everyone recognized from afar. 3 witnesses confirmed seeing Martha that afternoon. The sun was beginning to set when she passed the blacksmith's house, waved to his wife, and continued on her way. Martha never made it to the Henshaws, and she never went back home again. When landlady Henshaw realized Martha hadn't shown up, she found it strange but wasn't immediately alarmed. Perhaps she had changed her mind. Perhaps she had felt unwell and gone home. But the next day, when she went to Martha's property to check, she found the house locked, the chickens hungry in the coop, and no sign that anyone had returned the previous night. That's when the panic started to spread. The men of the region quickly organized themselves. They formed search parties that scoured every inch of that road, the surrounding woods, the streams, the ravines. They searched for days. Martha's basket was never found. The brown shawl never turned up. No piece of fabric, no clear footprint, no sign of struggle or escape. It was as if Martha Crowley had simply evaporated into the cold November air. The sheriff of Allegheny County, a man named Thomas Bridger, personally took charge of the investigation. Bridger was known for his persistence, but also for his skepticism. He didn't believe in unexplained disappearances. For him, there was always someone behind it. There was always a motive. And he was determined to find both. Initial suspicions fell on a drifter who had been seen in the area days before the disappearance. A middle-aged man with a grey beard, wearing shabby clothes, who begged for food at farms and slept in barns when he got permission. But when Bridger finally located him, in a small town 30 kilometers away, the man had a solid alibi. On the day of Martha's disappearance, he was working on a farm, witnessed by 5 different people. Then Bridger turned his attention to the neighbors. He spoke to everyone who knew Martha, one by one, and that's when things started to get strange. Because the more he asked, the more he realized there was something no one wanted to say. An uncomfortable silence hung over every conversation. Averted glances, vague answers. It was as if everyone knew something but had made a silent pact never to reveal it. Winter arrived in full force in December, covering everything with thick snow. The searches had to be suspended. Bridger didn't give up, but now he had to wait. Wait for the snow to melt. Wait for spring to bring answers. But the spring of 1902 brought something far worse than silence. When March of 1902 finally arrived, and the snow began to recede from the Pennsylvania hills, Sheriff Bridger resumed his search with renewed energy. He had spent the winter months reviewing every detail, every testimony, every fragment of information he had gathered, and something continued to bother his mind. That silence. That feeling that everyone knew more than they were saying. That's when a second person disappeared. Eleanor Vance was 32 years old and worked as a seamstress. She lived in a rented house on the outskirts of a small village called Millvale, a few kilometers from where Martha had last been seen. Eleanor was not married, lived alone, and supported herself with her sewing work for the wealthier families in the region. She was a reserved woman who spoke little and smiled even less. On the morning of March 23rd, Eleanor left home, telling her landlady that she was going to deliver dresses to 2 nearby farms. She carried a large cloth bag, where she kept her neatly folded orders. She wore a grey coat and a dark hat. 3 people saw her walking along the main road, waving politely as she passed acquaintances. Eleanor Vance never returned home. This time the alarm was immediate. People were still shaken by Martha's disappearance, and now another woman had vanished without a trace. Panic gripped the region. Families began locking their doors even during the day. Women started avoiding walking alone. And rumors began circulating with increasing force. Bridger organized new searches, even more extensive than the previous ones. This time, he brought men from Pittsburgh, experienced trackers, and even some sniffer dogs that had been trained to find missing people. They searched the same paths, the same woods, expanding the search perimeter. They found Eleanor's purse 2 days later, abandoned by a stream that cut through the forest. The purse was empty. The dresses she was carrying had disappeared, but there were no signs of violence, no marks of a struggle, no indication that she had been dragged or forced to go anywhere. It was as if Eleanor had simply dropped her bag there and walked into the woods of her own accord, which obviously made no sense whatsoever. Pittsburgh newspapers began covering the cases. Sensational headlines spoke of a predator in the hills, of hidden dangers on rural roads, of women who vanished like smoke. Fear spread beyond the region. Letters arrived at the sheriff's office every day, some offering help, others presenting absurd theories, and many simply expressing terror. It was in this climate of growing paranoia that Bridger received an unexpected visit. An elderly man who identified himself only as Mr. Whitmore appeared at the sheriff's office on a rainy April afternoon. He said he had information about the disappearances, but that he would only speak in private. Bridger took him to a closed room, and what he heard there completely changed the course of the investigation. Whitmore recounted that there was an abandoned property in the hills, a place that people in the region had avoided for years. The house had belonged to a family that had left the area suddenly decades ago, without explanation, leaving everything behind. Since then, the property had fallen into ruin, but there were old rumors about that place, rumors that no one wanted to repeat aloud. According to Whitmore, some people had seen movement on that property recently, smoke billowing from the chimney at night, dim lights in the broken windows, strange sounds echoing among the surrounding trees. He didn't know who was there, but he thought Bridger should investigate. And then, before leaving, Whitmore said something that chilled the sheriff's blood. He said it wasn't the first time women had disappeared in that region. Bridger spent the entire night rummaging through the county's old archives, and he found what he was looking for. Between 1887 and 1889, 3 women had disappeared under similar circumstances. All lived alone. All were last seen walking along rural roads. None of them were found. At the time, the sheriff in charge had conducted investigations that led nowhere, and the cases ended up forgotten, buried under piles of dusty documents. But now Bridger had a concrete lead. He had a place to investigate. The following morning he gathered 6 trusted men and set off for the abandoned property. The path was difficult, covered in dense vegetation that encroached on the old trail. When they finally arrived, they found a dilapidated wooden house with a partially collapsed roof and moss-covered walls. The windows were broken, and the front door hung by a single hinge. But there were recent footprints in the mud around the house. Someone had been there. Bridger and his men entered cautiously. The interior was dark and cold, smelling of mildew and damp earth. There were clear signs that someone had used the place recently. Fresh ashes in the fireplace, leftover food on a makeshift table, a blanket spread on the floor of one of the rooms. And then, in the basement, they found something that made everyone instinctively recoil. The cellar was accessed by a narrow, rotten wooden staircase that creaked with every step. Bridger went down first, holding a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the damp stone walls. The air down there was thick, heavy with a strange smell he couldn't quite identify. It was something between churned-up earth and something more unsettling that he preferred not to name. The space was small, with a low ceiling that forced the men to hunch their backs. Crates were stacked in one corner, covered in old cobwebs. Rusty tools hung from hooks on the walls, and in the center of the basement, something made Bridger stop in his tracks. It was a hole dug in the hard-packed earth, approximately 1 meter wide and impossible to determine in depth without closer investigation. Around it, The earth had been recently disturbed, dark and damp, and next to the hole there was a piece of brown fabric partially buried. Bridger recognized it immediately. It was the same type of fabric as the shawl Martha Crowley was wearing the day she disappeared. His men began to dig carefully, using shovels they found in the basement. With each layer of earth removed, the tension increased. No one spoke. The only sounds were the tools cutting through the soil and the men's heavy breathing. They dug for hours, going deeper and deeper, until they finally reached something solid. It wasn't what they expected to find. At the bottom of the hole was a kind of tunnel, a narrow passage that ran horizontally, dug with rudimentary tools, precariously supported by old planks. The tunnel was too shallow for a man to pass through standing upright. He would have to crawl. And it led somewhere deep within the earth, disappearing into total darkness. Bridger looked at his men and saw fear etched on every face. None of them wanted to go in there, but he knew he had no choice. If there was any chance of finding Martha and Eleanor, if there was any possibility of discovering what had really happened, the answer lay at the end of that tunnel. He went in alone. Crawling with his flashlight in front of him, Bridger advanced through the narrow tunnel. The earthen walls pressed against his body on both sides. Roots hung from the low ceiling, brushing against his back. The air grew thinner and thinner as he progressed. He could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. He could feel the sweat running down his face despite the cold. After what seemed like endless minutes, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Bridger raised his flashlight, and what he saw froze him completely. The chamber was a space excavated for a specific purpose, about 3 meters in diameter. The walls were lined with carefully arranged stones, as if someone had built it with time and patience. In the center, there was a wooden structure that resembled a table or makeshift altar, and on this structure, arranged in an almost ceremonial manner, were personal objects. A neatly folded brown shawl, an empty wicker basket, a grey coat with wooden buttons, scraps of fabric that looked like they had been worn, women's shoes, several pairs lined up side by side, and more things, many other things that had clearly belonged to different people over the years. But there were no bodies. There were no remains. There was nothing to indicate the final fate of the missing women. Bridger examined each object with trembling hands. He recognized Martha's shawl. He recognized the coat that witnesses described Eleanor wearing, but there were other belongings there, things that probably belonged to the women who disappeared years before, in 1887 and 1889, and perhaps even older items that were never reported. On the walls of the chamber, someone had carved marks. They weren't words, but strange symbols, repetitive patterns that didn't make immediate sense. Bridger copied some of them into his notebook, trembling as he drew. There were also dates engraved, years, 1887, 1889, 1901, and next to each date, vertical lines, as if someone were counting something. When he finally emerged from the tunnel, Bridger was pale and sweating profusely. His men helped him up, asked him urgent questions, but he couldn't immediately form coherent words. He needed to sit down, breathe, and organize his thoughts before he could recount what he had found. The discovery of that underground chamber changed everything. Now it was no longer just about 2 isolated disappearances. It was something much bigger, something that spanned decades, something carefully planned and executed by someone who knew that region like the back of their hand. But who? And where was that person now? Bridger ordered his men to stand guard on the abandoned property. If anyone returned there, they would be captured. Meanwhile, he went back to his office and began piecing together the puzzle. He reviewed every detail of the old investigations, looked for patterns, and tried to find connections between the victims beyond the obvious. And then he realized something crucial. All the missing women had something in common besides living alone. All of them, without exception, had last been seen walking towards the same general area of the hills. Not exactly the same path, but always converging on the same region where the abandoned property was located. It was as if someone was drawing them there. But how? And why? Bridger spent days reinterrogating everyone who had witnessed the disappearances, and this time, armed with the new information, he began to press harder. He insisted that someone must know something, that it was impossible for so much to happen without anyone noticing anything suspicious. That's how he finally managed to break the silence. A woman named Sarah Brennan sought out Bridger on a cloudy afternoon in May. She arrived at the sheriff's office, with her face covered by a dark veil, and asked to speak privately. Her hands trembled as she held a cup of tea he offered her, and her voice was almost a whisper when she finally began to speak. Sarah recounted that there was a man in the region, someone she knew only as Dr. Monroe. He wasn't a real doctor, but people called him that because he claimed to have knowledge of herbs and treatments that conventional medicine ignored. Monroe had appeared in the region around 1885, coming from nowhere, and had settled in a small, isolated cabin in the hills. At first, people were suspicious of him. He was a tall, thin man with light eyes that seemed to see right through people. He spoke little and smiled even less. But gradually he began to gain the trust of some residents. He offered remedies for illnesses that the city's doctors couldn't cure. He charged little or nothing, and apparently he had results. Sarah said that her own sister had consulted Monroe years ago when she was suffering from constant pain that no treatment relieved. Monroe had given her an herbal concoction, and the pain had disappeared. Other people had similar stories, and that's how he became a well-known figure, although he always kept his distance from the community. But there was something strange about Monroe. He seemed especially interested in women who lived alone. He would show up at their properties offering help with heavy work, home repairs, and firewood for the winter. He never charged anything, always polite, always helpful, and the women, grateful for his help, began to trust him. Sarah hesitated for a long moment before continuing. Then she revealed what had truly brought her there. Her sister, the one Monroe had treated, disappeared in 1889. She was one of the women who were never found, one of the old cases Bridger had uncovered in the files, and Sarah had always suspected Monroe, but she never had the courage to speak. She was afraid. Everyone was afraid of him, because there were rumors, whispers, that circulated only in the most private conversations. They said that Monroe wasn't just a healer. They said he performed strange rituals in his cabin, that he believed in dark forces that inhabited the depths of the earth, that he was searching for something, some kind of forbidden knowledge that could only be obtained through practices that no one dared to name clearly. Bridger listened silently, noting every detail. When Sarah finished, he thanked her for her courage and promised to investigate. And then he asked the crucial question, where was Monroe now? Sarah shook her head. No one knew for sure. He had disappeared from sight a few months ago, around October 1901, shortly before Martha vanished. His cabin was abandoned, but some people swore they had seen him occasionally, always in the distance, always at night, walking along the hillside paths like a ghost. With this new information, Bridger mounted a larger operation. He brought in reinforcements from Pittsburgh, armed and experienced men. He organized systematic searches throughout the region, focusing especially on the most remote areas of the hills, and he managed to locate Monroe's old cabin. The place was even more isolated than the abandoned property where they had found the tunnel. To get there, one had to follow almost invisible trails, cross 2 streams, and climb a steep slope covered in dense pine trees. The cabin itself was small and surprisingly well preserved, built with solid logs and a wooden shingle roof that had withstood the test of time. The door was locked from the inside. Bridger and his men broke down the door, and what they found inside was disturbing in a different way. The cabin was Spartan, almost empty. There was a simple bed in one corner, a small table, a chair. Shelves covered all the walls, filled with glass jars containing dried herbs, roots, and powdered substances of various colors. There were also books, dozens of them, stacked in careful order. Bridger examined the books. Most were in English, but some were in languages he didn't recognize. The titles spoke of ancient philosophies, mystical practices, theories about the nature of consciousness and existence. There were notes in the margins, written in small, precise handwriting, comments Monroe had made about what he was reading. On a desk in the corner, Bridger found notebooks, diaries where Monroe recorded her thoughts and experiments, and it was there that the truth began to reveal itself in a terrifying way. Monroe believed he had discovered something fundamental about human nature. He wrote about the possibility of transcending physical existence, of achieving a higher state of consciousness through what he called separation rituals. According to his notes, he had been testing his theories for years, always seeking volunteers willing to participate in his experiments. But Bridger soon realized there were no genuine volunteers. Monroe had a special ability to identify vulnerable, lonely people, desperate for some kind of connection or purpose. He won them over with kindness and attention, gaining their trust over months, sometimes years. And when he finally believed they were ready, he led them to the abandoned property, to that underground chamber. What happened there, Monroe described in vague and philosophical terms. He was talking about liberation, about transcendence, about crossing invisible thresholds. But he never explained exactly what he did. He never described the rituals in concrete detail. It was as if he purposefully left gaps in the records, as if he wanted to preserve some kind of secret even in his private diaries. What was clear, however, was that none of the women who participated in these rituals ever returned, and Monroe wrote about it as if it was something natural, expected, even desirable, as if they had achieved exactly what they were looking for. Bridger felt his stomach churn as he read. He was faced with the confessions of someone clearly disturbed, someone who had rationalized terrible acts through a distorted philosophy. But the most important piece of the puzzle was still missing. Where was Monroe now? And more importantly, where were Martha and Eleanor? Monroe's last diary entry was dated March 20th, 1902, just 3 days before Eleanor Vance disappeared. In it, he wrote about a premonition, a growing feeling that his work was being observed, that the forces he had studied so extensively were about to reveal something monumental. He mentioned that he was preparing for a final ritual, something he described as the culmination of decades of research and experimentation. Bridger ordered his men to search every inch of the cabin. They lifted floorboards, checked the walls for hidden compartments, examined every book looking for hidden pages or maps. And that's how they found something crucial, a detailed drawing of the region, with specific markings that seemed to indicate important locations. The abandoned property was marked with a circle, but there were other markings as well, small X's scattered across the hills, each accompanied by a date. Bridger counted 12 markings in total, 12 different places, 12 dates spread over almost 20 years. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized he was looking at a visual record of all the disappearances. But there was a 13th marker on the map. It was in a remote location, even deeper in the hills in an area few people knew. Next to this marker, Monroe had written only one word, portal. Bridger decided they needed to investigate that place immediately. He gathered his best men, checked their weapons, and took enough provisions to spend the night in the hills if necessary. And at dawn the next day they set off, following the map's directions. The journey was arduous. The terrain grew increasingly steep and uneven as they advanced. They passed through areas where the trees grew so densely that they blocked almost all sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the day. They crossed icy streams, climbed moss-covered rock formations, and followed animal tracks where human paths disappeared completely. It took them almost 6 hours to reach the location marked on the map, and when they finally found it, they understood why Monroe had chosen that place. It was an impressive natural formation, a fissure in the rock that opened up on a hillside like a wound in the earth. The opening was about 2 meters high and 1 meter wide and penetrated deep into the mountain, disappearing into the darkness. Ice stalagmites hung from the entrance like sharp teeth, and a cold wind blew constantly from inside the cave, carrying a mineral and damp odor. Around the entrance, Monroe had built a sort of altar, stones arranged in concentric circles, symbols carved into the larger rocks, the same strange patterns that Bridger had seen in the underground chamber, and scattered on the floor were objects clearly belonging to the missing women. A silver brooch, a faded hairband, a prayer book with worn chants, small personal treasures abandoned there as offerings. Bridger lit torches and entered the cave with 3 of his men. The interior was even more impressive than the entrance. The natural fissure opened into an underground gallery of considerable proportions, with the ceiling rising perhaps 10 meters high in some places. Rock formations created natural pillars that supported the structure. The sound of dripping water echoed constantly, creating a ghostly and hypnotic melody. They advanced cautiously, following a path that appeared to have been frequently used. The ground was worn in places, smoothed by years of foot traffic. The walls displayed more carved symbols, more markings that Monroe had left to document his obsession. The main gallery branched off into several smaller tunnels. Bridger chose the largest one, the one that seemed most busy, and continued down. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of the water grew louder. They were clearly descending toward an underground river. After walking for perhaps 15 minutes, the tunnel opened into an immense chamber, and there, illuminated by the flickering light of the torches, Bridger finally found what he was looking for. In the center of the chamber was a sort of encampment, an area where someone had clearly lived recently. There were blankets spread on the stone floor, remnants of food in a bag hanging from a rock ledge, a small pile of firewood beside a recently extinguished campfire. The ashes were still warm, and tied to a rock formation, using thick ropes that cut into their wrists, were two women. Martha Crowley and Eleanor Vance were alive. They were weak, dehydrated, with sunken eyes and cracked lips. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their hair tangled. When the torchlight illuminated their faces, they blinked with difficulty, as if they had spent so long in darkness that the light hurt them. Bridger and his men rushed to free them. They cut the ropes with knives, holding the women when their legs gave way, and they could no longer support themselves. Martha began to cry silently, too weak even to make a sound. Eleanor remained silent, staring blankly into space with an expression Bridger would never forget. It was as if part of her had been trapped in that darkness forever. But Monroe wasn't there. Despite all the signs indicating that he had been in that chamber recently, he had disappeared. And when they questioned Martha and Eleanor about his whereabouts, they both shook their heads. Eleanor managed to whisper only a few words, her voice hoarse and broken. He went deeper. Bridger looked to the back of the chamber and saw that there was another passage. This one was different from the previous ones, narrower, steeper, clearly natural and unaltered by human hands. And from it came that constant sound of running water, louder now, almost deafening. He knew he had to keep going. He knew Monroe was down there, somewhere in the unexplored depths of that mountain, but looking at Martha and Eleanor, seeing the state they were in, he understood that his priority had to be getting them out of there alive. He left 2 men to continue exploring the cave, while he and the third helped the women climb back to the surface. The return journey was agonizing. Martha and Eleanor could barely walk. They practically had to be carried. With each step, Bridger feared they wouldn't make it, but both possessed an inner strength that kept them going, a will to survive that overcame the physical trauma. When they finally emerged from the cave and the light of dusk bathed their faces, Martha collapsed to the ground and embraced the earth as if she never wanted to let go. It took them almost all night to descend the mountain with Martha and Eleanor. The way back was treacherous in the darkness, lit only by torches that flickered in the cold wind blowing through the pines. Bridger and his men had to stop every few minutes to allow the women to rest, catch their breath, and gather strength to continue. Eleanor had developed a deep cough that shook her violently with each bout. Martha's feet were covered in open wounds, wrapped in makeshift rags that quickly became soaked with blood. But they kept going. There was something about those 2 women that deeply impressed Bridger. After everything they had been through, after weeks trapped in that suffocating darkness, fed only enough to keep them alive, they still fought with every ounce of energy they possessed. They didn't complain. They didn't ask to stop. They simply put one foot in front of the other, focused solely on escaping that cursed place. When they finally reached the main road, it was already past 3 in the morning. Bridger had sent one of his men ahead to fetch a wagon, and it was waiting for them there, pulled by 2 strong horses. They settled Martha and Eleanor in the back of the wagon on thick blankets and set off towards the house of a doctor Bridger knew in Millvale. Dr. Harrington was a 60-year-old man with white hair and steady hands who had served as a surgeon during the Civil War and had seen enough horrors not to be easily shaken. But when he examined Martha and Eleanor that morning, even he paled, not only from the physical injuries, which were numerous, the rope marks, the severe dehydration, the infected wounds, but from what he saw in their eyes. There was an emptiness there, an absence he recognized in soldiers who had been prisoners of war for too long. Harrington worked until dawn, tending to the 2 women. He cleaned their wounds, applied ointments, bandaged their wrists and ankles, administered fluids and medicine for the fever that both had begun to develop. And then, when the sun finally rose over the Pennsylvania hills, he sat down with Bridger and had a difficult conversation. He said that Martha and Eleanor would recover physically. It would take time, but their bodies were young and resilient. What worried him was what he couldn't see, the damage those weeks of captivity had caused to their minds. He had seen this before, this kind of trauma that doesn't heal with bandages and medication. And he warned Bridger that when the time came to interrogate them, he would need patience and sensitivity. Bridger agreed, but he also knew he couldn't wait much longer. The 2 men he had left exploring the caves still hadn't returned, and with each passing hour his worry grew. He needed to know what Monroe was planning. He needed to understand what that troubled man intended to do deep within that mountain. While Martha and Eleanor slept under the effects of the sedatives Harrington had administered, Bridger returned to his office and began to gather all the information he had collected. He spread documents across his desk, Monroe's diaries, the marked map, the records of old disappearances. the drawings of symbols found in the caves, and he tried to assemble a coherent picture of what he was facing. Monroe wasn't simply a murderer, that was clear now. He was something more complex and perhaps more dangerous. A man consumed by a philosophical obsession he believed to be a quest for transcendental knowledge. He had dedicated decades to exploring those caves, mapping their depths, searching for something he believed existed down there. And the women he took with him weren't random victims. He chose them carefully, prepared them over months, convinced them they were participating in something bigger than themselves. But what exactly was he searching for? The diaries spoke vaguely of portals, of thresholds between states of consciousness, of the possibility of accessing dimensions of existence that modern science ignored. It was a tangle of mysticism, distorted philosophy, and something bordering on pure madness. There was one particular entry in the diary that Bridger reread multiple times. Dated 1898, Monroe wrote about a discovery he had made deep within the caves. He mentioned finding a chamber where the groundwater formed a perfectly still lake, so black and deep that his torch couldn't illuminate the bottom. And in that place, he claimed to have experienced something that completely changed his understanding of reality. Monroe described sensations of detachment, of floating between worlds, of hearing voices that came from nowhere but seemed to emerge from the rock itself. He interpreted this as evidence that he had discovered a place of power, a point where the barrier between the physical world and something beyond was thinner. And since then, he had dedicated his life to trying to definitively cross that barrier. The women he took with him were, in his distorted mind, voluntary participants in rituals that supposedly facilitated this crossing. He believed that certain people had a greater sensitivity to these experiences, and he spent years identifying and preparing those he considered suitable. The fact that none of them ever returned didn't seem to bother him. On the contrary, he interpreted it as success, as proof that they had effectively crossed over to the other side. Bridger closed his eyes and massaged his temples. He was dealing with the mind of someone deeply disturbed, someone who had rationalized terrible acts through a belief system that made sense only to himself. And the most frightening thing was that Monroe seemed to genuinely believe all of it. There was no cynicism in his writings, no admissions of guilt or remorse, just an absolute conviction that he was doing something important, something necessary. Around noon, the two men Bridger had left in the caves finally returned. They arrived exhausted, covered in mud, and with troubled expressions. They sat down in the sheriff's office and reported what they had found. They had followed the deepest tunnel as far as possible. The passage descended ever steeper, eventually turning into an almost vertical climb that required holding onto slippery rock ledges. The sound of the water grew deafening as they descended, and finally, after what they estimated to be a descent of perhaps 50 meters, they reached the chamber that Monroe had described in his diary. The underground lake was real, a perfectly still expanse of black water that stretched beyond the reach of their torches. The surrounding chamber was circular, its ceiling rising like a natural dome sculpted by water over millennia. The walls glistened with damp minerals that reflected the torchlight in almost hypnotic patterns, and on the shore of the lake, they had found clear signs that Monroe had been there recently. There were campfire burns, remnants of burnt candles, and more of those strange symbols etched into the surrounding rocks. But most disturbing were the objects arranged in a perfect circle around a specific point on the water's edge. They were personal belongings: wedding rings, lockets with portraits, brooches, decorated hair combs, small prayer books. Each object had clearly belonged to a different person. The men counted 12 sets of objects in total, 12 women whose lives had been stolen over decades, their most precious possessions left there as some kind of macabre memorial or ritualistic offering. But Monroe wasn't there. There was no body, no signs of struggle or accident, only those carefully arranged objects and the oppressive silence of that underground chamber. The men had called his name, and the echo had returned multiple times from the stone walls, but no human response had come. They had explored around the lake as far as possible, but the water extended too far, and there was no safe way to continue without proper equipment. Eventually, with provisions dwindling and fearing they would be trapped down there, they decided to surface and report what they had found. Bridger listened silently, absorbing every detail. Then he asked if they had noticed anything unusual in the water, any disturbance, any sign that something or someone might be submerged there. The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them finally admitted that yes, they had noticed something strange, At one point, the perfectly smooth surface of the water showed a kind of very slow swirl, as if something were circulating in the depths, creating a subtle but perceptible current. And there was also a sound, very low, almost imperceptible beneath the constant noise of the dripping water, a sound that could simply be the natural echo of the caves, but which could also be interpreted as something more. A murmur, a vibration, something that came from very, very far below. Bridger spent the following days organizing a larger expedition to fully explore the caves. He knew he needed experienced men, proper equipment, and a careful strategy. He couldn't risk more lives by entering that subterranean labyrinth unprepared. Meanwhile, Martha and Eleanor began to slowly recover under the care of Dr. Harrington. It was Eleanor who first managed to speak coherently about what had happened. On a rainy afternoon, 5 days after they had been rescued, she asked to speak with Bridger. He sat beside her bed, notebook in hand, and listened as she told her story, in a voice that was still weak but surprisingly firm. Eleanor said she had met Monroe about a year before. He had appeared at her door offering firewood for the winter, and she, always struggling to do everything on her own, had gratefully accepted. Monroe had returned several times, always kind, always helpful. He talked to her about books, about philosophy, about existential questions that Eleanor had never imagined discussing with anyone. She had felt seen, understood in a way she had never experienced before. Gradually, Monroe began to talk about his discoveries in the caves, about places where reality functioned differently, where it was possible to experience expanded states of consciousness. He invited her to visit these places, promising it would be a transformative experience. And Eleanor, lonely and searching for some meaning in her life, accepted. The first visit to the caves was during the day, in a shallow area that Monroe had shown her as if it were a precious secret. He explained the symbols engraved on the walls, spoke of ancient civilizations that supposedly had known those places before them. Eleanor felt special, chosen to share that knowledge. The visits continued for months, each one deeper, each one longer. Monroe taught her breathing and meditation techniques, preparing her for what he called the final experience. And Eleanor trusted him completely. He never imagined there was any danger. She never realized she was being manipulated. On the day of her disappearance, she hadn't been forced. She had gone voluntarily to meet Monroe, believing she would finally participate in the ritual he spoke so much about. Only when they reached the deepest chamber, when Monroe tied her to the rock, saying it was a necessary part of the process, did Eleanor begin to feel fear. But then, it was too late. She spent weeks in that darkness. Monroe would come down periodically bringing water and small amounts of food. He would talk to her, explaining that she was being prepared, that her body needed to be purified through fasting and isolation. He said that soon she would be ready for the final crossing. Eleanor had tried to argue, to plead, but Monroe remained calm and resolute, as if he were performing a sacred task. It was only when Martha arrived, also tied to the same rock formation, that Eleanor understood she wasn't the first. Martha was even weaker, having been captured weeks before, and in the long hours of darkness, whispering to each other when Monroe wasn't around, the two women shared their stories and recognized the pattern. Monroe had used the same approach with both of them: the initial kindness, the philosophical conversations, the gradual invitation to explore the caves, the slow and meticulous preparation. He was patient, methodically patient, building trust over months before finally revealing his true intentions. Eleanor hesitated before continuing, her eyes fixed on some distant point. Then she recounted that the last time Monroe had descended into the chamber where they were imprisoned, he had seemed different. There was an urgency in him that hadn't existed before, an almost feverish excitement. He had said that he finally understood what he needed to do, that all other attempts had failed because he himself hadn't made the necessary sacrifice. He had mentioned the other women he had taken to the caves over the years. He spoke of them not as victims, but as pioneers who had tried to cross the threshold but failed because they were still too attached to the material world. According to Monroe, he had realized his mistake. It wasn't enough to guide other people. He himself needed to be the one to cross, to make the final journey. The night before they were rescued, Monroe had temporarily freed them from the ropes. He had given them water and food, more than they had received in weeks. He had apologized, something that completely surprised them both. He said he now understood that he had been mistaken, that he had brought them there for the wrong reasons, guided by flawed interpretations of his own findings. Then Monroe showed them a small notebook he always carried with him. In it was a detailed map of the caves, including passages that had taken him years to discover and map. There were also instructions on how to get out of there, details he had never shared before. He said that if something happened to him, they should use that information to escape. And then Monroe took a torch and went down the passage that led to the underground lake. Eleanor and Martha heard his footsteps echoing further and further away, and then only silence. He never returned. They had waited for hours, perhaps a whole day. It's hard to know in the constant darkness. They considered trying to follow the instructions in the notebook and escape, but they were too weak, too afraid of getting even deeper lost in the caves. And it was when they had almost lost all hope that they heard distant voices, human voices that were not Monroe's. That's when Bridger and his men finally found them. Bridger absorbed it all in silence. He asked a few clarifying questions, noted specific details, and then he asked if Eleanor had any theory about what Monroe intended to do in that underground lake. She shook her head slowly, but then mentioned something that made Bridger shudder. Monroe had spoken repeatedly about submersion, about how water was an element of transformation, of passage between states. He had mentioned rituals from various ancient cultures, where immersion in deep waters was used as a method of achieving visions or crossing over to other realms of existence. And that last night, when he said goodbye to them, Monroe had said something strange, that he would finally discover what was at the bottom of that lake, and that when he emerged, if he emerged, he would be a different person. Martha, who had woken during the conversation and listened silently from the bed beside her, finally spoke in a hoarse voice. She added a detail that Eleanor hadn't mentioned. Monroe had been carrying something with him when he last went down, a heavy chain, the kind used to restrain animals, wrapped around his body. And he had also taken a large stone that he had spent hours carefully selecting from among the cave's rock formations. Bridger understood the implication immediately. Monroe didn't just intend to dive into that lake, he intended to sink, and he didn't plan on coming back. In the days that followed, Bridger assembled a team of 10 men, including 2 who had experience diving and recovering objects from rivers and lakes. He obtained strong ropes, additional flashlights, and safety equipment. He prepared to descend into the caves again, this time with the specific goal of exploring that underground lake and discovering what had really happened to Monroe. But before leaving, Bridger did something he felt was necessary. He visited Sarah Brennan, the woman who had initially told him about Monroe. He found her at her modest home on the outskirts of Millvale, and this time she received him without a veil, without hiding her face marked by years of silence and guilt. Bridger told her that Martha and Eleanor were alive and recovering. He saw relief flood her face, followed by tears she didn't try to hold back. Then he told her he needed to know everything about her sister, about how she had met Monroe, about the last days before she disappeared in 1889. Sarah spoke for hours. She recounted details she had never shared with anyone, memories she had kept for years. Her sister Rebecca had been a strong and independent woman who had refused to marry merely for social convenience. She preferred her freedom, her autonomy, even if it meant living alone and facing the judgment of her neighbors. Rebecca had met Monroe the same way as all the others. He had appeared offering help when she needed it most, winning her trust through intelligent conversation and genuine attention. Sarah remembered how her sister spoke of him with growing admiration, how Monroe understood things other men never bothered to understand, how he made her feel valued not despite her independence but because of it. Sarah admitted that she had felt jealous at the time. Her sister seemed so happy, so enthusiastic about the philosophical conversations she had with Monroe, about the places he showed her in the hills. And then, one autumn day in 1889, Rebecca simply didn't come home. Sarah waited, searched, pleaded with the authorities to investigate. But at that time, adult women who voluntarily disappeared were not a priority. It was assumed that they had run away, started a new life elsewhere. Sarah always knew something terrible had happened, but he had no proof, nothing but a suspicion that no one took seriously. And over the years, while other women disappeared, she carried the weight of her silence like a stone on her chest. She constantly wondered if she could have prevented it, if she should have spoken louder, insisted more. Bridger comforted her as best he could. He said she had done what was possible under the circumstances, that no one could have foreseen the extent of Monroe's obsession. But the words sounded empty, even to him. The truth was that this man had operated for decades in plain sight of an entire community, and no one had stopped him, because no one had truly wanted to see. When he finally set off back to the caves 3 days later, Bridger carried with him not only equipment and experienced men, but also a renewed sense of purpose. He needed to find Monroe, dead or alive. He needed to end this story once and for all, not just for justice, but for the families who never had answers, for the women whose fates remained unknown for so long. Descending to the subterranean lake took several hours. Even with proper preparation, the path was treacherous and exhausting. When they finally reached the circular chamber with its black, still waters, Bridger felt the same chill his men had described. There was something about that place that affected people on a deep, primal level, a feeling of invisible vastness, of depth that went far beyond the physical. The objects were still arranged in a circle on the lake shore. 12 sets of personal belongings, each representing an interrupted life, a story that would never reach its natural end. Bridger asked his men to collect everything carefully. Those items needed to return to their families. They needed to receive the respect they deserved. Then he turned his attention to the water. The 2 divers he had brought began their preparations. They tied long ropes around their waists, checked their equipment, and lit special flashlights designed for underwater use. The plan was simple. They would descend following the wall of the chamber, always maintaining contact with the rock, exploring the perimeter as far as was safe. The first diver cautiously entered the water. The temperature was freezing, so cold it instantly took your breath away. He made a hand signal and began to descend, his flashlight creating a halo of light that grew fainter as he sank. Bridger and the others watched from the shore, holding the rope, counting the seconds. After perhaps 3 minutes, the rope stopped unwinding. They waited. No sign of return. Then slowly the rope began to be pulled back. They helped the diver to surface, and when he finally came out of the water, he was trembling violently, not just from the cold. He reported that he had descended about 15 meters following the stone wall. The depth of the lake seemed much greater. His flashlight couldn't reach the bottom. But he had found something caught between the rocks halfway down. A chain, the same one Martha had described Monroe carrying. It was firmly coiled around a ledge, and attached to it were remnants of fabric, possibly from Monroe's clothes. But there was no body. The current flowed downward, disappearing into the darkness. The diver had tried to follow it, but the depth was beginning to affect his ears and lungs. Furthermore, there was something else that had made him retreat. He described a sensation of movement in the water below him, as if something large were swirling in the depths. Probably just underground currents, he admitted, but combined with the absolute darkness and the penetrating cold, it had been enough to convince him to return. The second diver wanted to try going deeper. He was more experienced, having said he had dived in much more dangerous rivers. Bridger hesitated, but finally agreed. They tied a longer rope, doubled the safety precautions, and the man entered the water, quickly disappearing into the darkness. This time the wait was much longer. The rope continued to unwind for long minutes. Bridger began to get nervous considering pulling him back, when finally the rope stopped. They waited. Nothing happened. Then the rope was shaken 3 times, the agreed signal to begin pulling him back. When the diver surfaced, he was holding something, a large, heavy rock, the kind Monroe would have used to fasten himself, and tied to it with wire was a metal box, the kind used to keep important documents waterproof. Bridger picked up the box with trembling hands. It was sealed with wax around the edges. He carefully broke the seal and opened the lid. Inside was a notebook wrapped in oilcloth for added protection. Monroe's last diary. Sitting on the edge of that subterranean lake, illuminated by the flickering light of the torches, Bridger read the last words Monroe had left for the world. The handwriting was hurried, less careful than in previous diaries, as if he were writing against the clock. Monroe began by admitting his mistakes. He acknowledged that he had caused suffering, that his actions had destroyed lives, but he insisted that he had never acted out of cruelty or a desire to hurt. He genuinely believed he was exploring the frontiers of human knowledge, seeking answers to questions that conventional science and religion ignored. He described his experiences in that chamber over the years, the sensations of detachment he had experienced, the visions he had had in the depths of meditation. He spoke of the lake as if it were a living entity, a portal to something beyond immediate comprehension, and he admitted that his attempts to bring other people through that portal had failed because he had not understood the true nature of what he was seeking. The last pages of the diary were different, more focused, more lucid in a way. Monroe wrote that he had finally understood that the journey had to be solitary, that no one could cross it for another, that each person needed to make their own choice, take their own decision, and he had made his. He described his plan in clinical detail. He would tie the chain around his body, attach the heavy stone to it, and let himself sink to the bottom of the lake. He didn't know what he would find down there, perhaps just dark water and death by drowning. Perhaps something more, but he was ready to find out. The final entry was just one line, written in firm handwriting. "If anyone finds this, know that I came of my own free will, seeking answers that only darkness can provide." Bridger slowly closed the notebook. He looked at the black, still surface of the lake, imagining Monroe sinking into those depths, consciously choosing not to fight, not to try to breathe, simply letting himself go. There was something terribly sad about it, an entire life wasted in a search for meaning in places where there was only emptiness and death. The diver who had brought up the box confirmed that he had looked down. The current continued to descend, caught on the rock, but he hadn't been able to reach the bottom. The depth was simply too great, beyond human capabilities without specialized equipment. If Monroe was down there, he would remain there forever. Bridger made a decision at that moment. There would be no more attempts to recover Monroe's body. The risk was too great, and frankly, he saw no point in risking more lives for a man who had consciously chosen that end. The lake would keep its secret, and Monroe would remain where he had chosen to be. It was a strange kind of justice, Bridger thought, but perhaps the only possible one given the circumstances. Before leaving the chamber, Bridger asked his men to seal the passage leading there. They used stones and improvised mortar, made from minerals from the cave itself, blocking the tunnel so that no one else could easily descend. It wasn't an impenetrable barrier, but it would be enough to discourage curious onlookers and prevent future accidents. When they finally returned to the surface, it was night again. The stars shone over the Pennsylvania hills, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath the earth. Bridger took a deep breath of the cool night air, feeling as if he were emerging from a nightmare that had lasted for months. In the following days, he dedicated himself to the delicate task of notifying the families. He visited each one personally, bringing the objects recovered from the underground chamber. These were painful conversations, filled with tears held back for years. Some families reacted angrily, wanting to know why it had taken so long, why no one had properly investigated at the time. Others simply expressed gratitude for finally having some kind of closure, even if incomplete. Sarah Brennan received her sister Rebecca's locket, a delicate silver piece with a miniature portrait inside. She held it in her hands for long minutes, caressing its surface as if she could somehow touch her sister through it. Then she asked Bridger if Rebecca had suffered, if Monroe had hurt her. Bridger chose his words carefully. He said he believed Monroe had convinced those women to go with him willingly, that he wasn't violent in the traditional sense, but rather someone who manipulated through words and false promises. He didn't mention what he truly suspected had happened to those women who never returned. There were theories, dark possibilities, that he preferred not to explore aloud. Perhaps Monroe had taken them to that underground lake and convinced them to participate in some submersion ritual from which they did not return. Perhaps he had abandoned them in the depths of the caves to die of hunger and dehydration. Perhaps there were other chambers, other places they never found where the bodies still lay. The truth was, they would never know for sure. And perhaps that was for the best. Some families needed definitive answers, but others simply needed permission to move forward, and that's what Bridger tried to give them, as much as he could. Martha and Eleanor continued their slow but steady recovery. Dr. Harrington reported that physically they were improving well, gaining weight, regaining strength, but the psychological damage was deeper and would take much longer to heal, if ever. Both had constant nightmares. Eleanor had developed an intense fear of enclosed spaces and couldn't enter any windowless room without panicking. Martha had become incredibly distrustful of men, especially those who tried to be kind or helpful. Bridger visited them regularly during the following weeks, always accompanied by the ever-respectful and patient Dr. Harrington. He needed formal statements from them to officially close the case, but he was in no hurry. He would wait as long as necessary until they were ready. It was Martha who finally asked to give her full testimony almost a month after the rescue. She said she needed to do this, that it was part of her recovery to put everything into words, to transform the trauma into a narrative that could be filed away and kept out of her mind. Bridger listened attentively as she described every detail of her capture and captivity. Martha recounted the long conversations she had had with Monroe during the months he had been preparing her. He spoke of loneliness, of how society failed to understand people who thought differently, who sought more than ordinary existence offered, And Martha, widowed and isolated on her estate, had deeply identified with these words. She had felt understood for the first time in years. Monroe had invited her to see the caves gradually. First, the surface areas, beautiful and impressive but safe. He explained geological formations, told stories about ancient peoples who supposedly had used those caves as sacred places. Martha was fascinated, and when he finally suggested that she participate in a special ritual, something that very few people had the privilege of experiencing, she accepted without question. She only realized the mistake when she was already tied up in the deep chamber. When Monroe calmly explained that she would need to undergo a period of purification before the final ritual, that it could take weeks, perhaps months, but it was essential. Martha had tried to argue, then plead, finally scream, but Monroe had remained impassive, visiting her periodically, bringing minimal water and food, talking about patience and preparation. The worst thing, Martha said, wasn't the hunger or the cold or even the fear of dying there. The worst thing was the absolute solitude between Monroe's visits, the total darkness that erased any sense of time or space, the sounds of dripping water that eventually began to sound like voices, the feeling that she was dissolving, losing the outlines of who she was. When Eleanor arrived, also imprisoned, Martha initially felt relieved to have company, but that relief quickly turned to horror as she realized Monroe was repeating the pattern, that another woman would fall victim to the same manipulation. The two had conversed in whispers during the long hours of darkness, sharing stories, keeping each other mentally present and sane. And then Monroe had changed. That last visit when he seemed different, when he apologized and released them from the ropes, Martha said she didn't know if he genuinely regretted it or if he simply realized that his experiment had failed once again. Perhaps he finally understood that he couldn't force other people to share his distorted view of reality. Bridger meticulously documented everything. When Martha finished, he thanked her for her courage in reporting something so painful, and then he asked her a question he had been considering for weeks. Did she want him to make the case public? The Pittsburgh newspapers had been pressing for details, wanting to turn it into a sensational story that would sell thousands of copies. Martha thought for a long time before answering. Finally, she said no. She didn't want her life reduced to newspaper headlines. She didn't want to be known forever as the woman who had been a victim of the madman in the cave. She just wanted to try to rebuild her life in peace, away from the spotlight and the morbid curiosity of people. When consulted, Eleanor completely agreed. Both wanted the case to be filed quietly, without public fanfare. And Bridger, after careful consideration, decided to respect their wishes. He prepared detailed official reports that were filed in the county, but he did not provide sensational details to the newspapers. He only confirmed that the missing women had been found alive, that the perpetrator was dead and that the case was closed. There were complaints, obviously. Journalists argued that the public had a right to know, but Bridger stood firm. Some stories, he had decided, didn't need to be told in all their sordid details. Some truths could remain locked away in dusty files, known only to those directly involved. The abandoned property where the first tunnel was found was burned to the ground on the orders of the county. The entrance to the main cave was sealed with concrete, and a warning sign was installed alerting people to the dangers of collapse. It made no mention of what had actually been down there. Martha eventually sold her property and moved to a small town in western Pennsylvania, where no one knew her or her story. Eleanor stayed in Mill Vale for a few more months before also leaving, though Bridger never knew where she went. Both simply disappeared from the region, this time by choice, seeking fresh starts in places where the past wouldn't follow them. The years that followed were marked by a heavy silence that settled over the hills north of Pittsburgh. Bridger continued as sheriff of Allegheny County for another decade, dealing with common crimes, neighborly disputes, petty theft, and occasionally more serious cases. But nothing ever compared to those dark months of 1901 and 1902. That experience had fundamentally changed something in him, leaving a mark that would not fade with time. He kept Monroe's diaries locked in a special drawer in his office. Occasionally, late at night, when the building was empty and silent, he would take them out and reread certain passages, not out of morbid pleasure or unhealthy curiosity, but because he felt a strange responsibility to understand that man, to understand how someone could walk so deeply into their own distorted mind as to completely lose touch with basic humanity. Monroe hadn't been a monster in the traditional sense. He wasn't driven by rage or a desire to cause pain. He was worse in a way, someone who had constructed an elaborate philosophical framework to justify terrible actions, who genuinely believed he was seeking important knowledge. And that realization haunted Bridger more than any nightmare about dark caves or subterranean lakes. He often thought of the women who were never found. Rebecca, Sarah Brennan's sister, and the others whose names she had discovered in the old files. 10 women in total over almost 20 years, all simply vanished like smoke. Their bodies were probably still somewhere in that underground labyrinth, in chambers that were never explored, in depths that would remain inaccessible forever. Sometimes Bridger imagined those places, silent and dark beneath the earth, guardians of secrets that no one else would ever discover. He thought about how nature would slowly reclaim everything, how water and time would erase even the final traces of those interrupted lives. There was something peaceful about this idea, though it was also deeply melancholic. Sarah Brennan never fully recovered from the loss of her sister, but she found some measure of peace after Bridger returned the medallion to her. She began attending the local church more often, finding solace in a community of women who had lost loved ones in various ways. And eventually, years later, Bridger learned that she had moved to live with a cousin in Ohio, leaving behind the hills that held so many painful memories. The families of the other victims reacted in varied ways over time. Some never accepted the absence of bodies, of definitive confirmation. They maintained irrational hopes that perhaps their daughters, sisters, aunts were alive somewhere, suffering from amnesia or being held prisoner by some inexplicable circumstance. Others embraced the partial closure that Bridger had offered them, organized private memorials, and found ways to honor memories without needing physical graves. The region itself gradually changed. The hills where the caves once stood became known as a place to be avoided. Hunters who once roamed those trails began to choose other paths. Lumberjacks worked in more distant areas. The isolated properties that dotted the region were abandoned one after another, their families moving closer to villages and towns where there was safety in numbers. And as the years passed, the story began to transform into legend. People who hadn't lived through those events, who only knew fragmented versions passed down in whispers, began to add their own interpretations. They spoke of the caveman as if he were a supernatural creature instead of a deeply disturbed man. They told stories about the caves as if they were cursed places, touched by forces beyond human comprehension. Bridger listened to these stories with a mixture of frustration and resignation. The truth was disturbing enough without needing fanciful embellishments, but he understood that people needed to transform horror into narrative, to domesticate it through mythology. It was a way of dealing with something that would otherwise be too heavy to bear. In 1915, already 62 years old and feeling the weight of decades of public service, Bridger finally retired. He spent his last years in a small house on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, cultivating a modest garden and occasionally receiving visits from former colleagues who wanted to reminisce about old times. But he rarely spoke about the Monroe case, and when he did, he kept the details vague and impersonal. There was only one occasion when he spoke openly about it. It was on an autumn afternoon in 1919, when an ambitious young reporter managed to locate him and showed up at his door asking for an interview. The boy had found old references to the case in the county archives and was intrigued by the lack of public details. "I wanted to write an investigative article to bring the story to light decades later." Bridger initially refused, but the young man was persistent, and eventually the old sheriff agreed to talk on one condition: nothing he said would be published while he was alive, and even afterward, it should be presented in a way that protected the identity of the surviving victims. The reporter agreed, and for 3 consecutive afternoons, Bridger recounted the entire story. He spoke of Monroe, of the caves, of the diaries, and the distorted philosophy that had led that man into darkness. He spoke of Martha and Eleanor, of the courage they demonstrated in surviving and rebuilding their lives. He spoke of the families who lost loved ones without ever having definitive answers, and he spoke of human fragility, of how we all walk a fine line between reason and madness, between connection and isolation. The reporter absorbed everything, took meticulous notes, and when he finished, thanked Bridger for his trust. But he never published the story. Years later, after Bridger had passed away, the reporter, now a respected editor, would explain that he had decided that some stories didn't need to be told, that there was value in allowing certain horrors to remain buried, known only to those who needed to know them. The caves remained sealed, Occasionally, especially during periods of heavy rain, there were small collapses that exposed new openings. Each time, the local authorities quickly resealed them, keeping the area restricted. Over the decades, the forest reclaimed that space completely. Trees grew over the scars in the earth, dense bushes covered the old paths, and eventually it became almost impossible to determine exactly where the entrances had been. The subterranean lake remained untouched, its black waters guarding whatever Munro had taken with him to the depths. No modern expedition was ever mounted to explore it properly. There was not enough scientific interest to justify the cost and risk, and the local authorities preferred to leave the place alone. Sometimes, especially on winter nights when the wind howled through the pine trees on the hills, people who lived nearby swore they heard strange sounds coming from that direction, low murmurs, almost imperceptible, which could just be the wind passing through cracks in the rocks, but which could also be something more. No one investigated too closely. Some things, they decided, were better left alone. Martha lived until 1947, reaching the age of 74. She remarried in her new city to a kind man who worked as a carpenter and never pressed her about her past. They had 2 daughters who grew up never fully knowing what their mother had survived. Martha carried those memories in silence, sharing them only occasionally with her husband in the most intimate moments. When the darkness of night brought back fragments of those weeks in the caves, Eleanor disappeared from historical records after leaving Pennsylvania. There are indications that she may have traveled to the West Coast, perhaps changed her name, and started completely from scratch. Whether she found peace or spent the rest of her life haunted by trauma, no one can say for sure. Sometimes the absence of information is its own form of response, a conscious choice to erase the past and exist only in the present. The descendants of the affected families still live in the region, although few of them know the complete story. It is something that was deliberately not passed down from generation to generation, a family secret that naturally dissolved over time. Occasionally, someone discovers old references in family documents, a name that leads to research in county archives, and fragments of the truth briefly emerge before being filed away again and forgotten. The hills remain. Indifferent to the human drama that unfolded in their depths, they remain just hills, covered by dense forests, cut by icy streams, punctuated by rocky outcrops that existed millions of years before any human walked there and will continue to exist millions of years after. Nature has this liberating quality of perspective, reminding us how small and temporary we are and how our dramas are. And somewhere beneath those hills, in black waters that never see light, Munro rests. Whether he found the answers he sought, whether he experienced the transcendence he so desired, or whether he simply encountered the cold, final emptiness of death, are questions that will remain eternally unanswered. Perhaps it is fitting that way. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some questions have no satisfactory answers. What remains is memory, fragmented and imperfect, kept in dusty diaries and forgotten files, and perhaps a lesson about the fragility of the human mind, about how loneliness can distort perceptions, about how the search for meaning can lead us to places from which there is no return, about how we should be wary of those who promise easy answers to difficult questions, who offer purpose where there is only emptiness. The people who live in that region today rarely think about the sealed caves beneath their feet. They live their normal lives, worry about everyday problems, find joy in simple things, and that's fitting too. Life goes on, always